These cities were once home to millions, but are now abandoned in a state of disrepair and decay. What are the stories behind these deserted places? Well, today we'll be finding out. Join me as we take a look at 15 cities left abandoned. Number 15, Tianducheng, China. For every achievement in infrastructure China has, there are a few failed attempts that would rather be forgot about. One of them being Tianducheng. Also called the Sky City, construction of Tianducheng started in 2007 with the goal of essentially recreating the city of Paris. Everything was carefully curated, including the period-correct architecture, and there's even a 354-foot-tall Eiffel Tower in the middle of the city square, a replica from the famous fountain of the Luxembourg Gardens, and even a French-themed amusement park. Tianducheng would deliver a bit of European taste and culture without citizens having to leave China. The city was built to accommodate more than 10,000 residents, but as of today, it hasn't even come close to hitting that mark. The city is generally abandoned, although it's still home to about 2,000 people, all of whom allegedly work at the aforementioned theme park. But why didn't people flock to this French-themed city? It all came down to poor planning. Tianducheng is built in the middle of a rural area without an easy way for people to get there. It's all but cut off from the bustling metropolitan areas. The only visitors to Tianducheng these days are the occasional newly wedded Francophiles and tourists looking for an ironic attraction. Number 14, Ruby, Arizona. While American Western films depicting the Wild West are certainly a fun way to forget about your troubles, they also offer cinephiles a brief glimpse of life from that era. And while lone gunslingers with shady pasts may have been written up by Hollywood execs, the West was still 100% real, and the town of Ruby, Arizona is a shining example of that. Ruby was founded as a mining town back in the 1870s and was a place that many people hoped to find their fortune, mining for copper, zinc, lead, and silver, and if they were lucky, gold. And while it may sound silly, when Ruby opened its post office in 1910, that's when people really started to settle down there. But the town earned some notoriety over the years as the home to 3 ghastly double homicides, the Ruby murders. Bandits came to town and murdered the locals on 3 separate occasions, which sparked one of the largest manhunts in the American Southwest. Those events were enough to slowly drive out the 1,200 residents of Ruby, and the town was officially abandoned in 1940. But Ruby's story doesn't end there, because although it's been abandoned by people, the mines are home to almost 100,000 Mexican free-tailed bats, and people come from far and wide every summer to watch these creatures of the night rush from the mine shafts and take to the sky. Number 13, Wittenoom, Australia. The United States wasn't the only place that had miners and panhandlers looking for something shiny amidst the dirt. Western Australia was also full of mining towns back in the day, with Wittenoom being one of the more popular places to start digging. Wittenoom was founded in 1946 because the nearby gorge was chock full of blue asbestos, which was an important raw material in the early 20th century for building. And in just 10 years' time, the town became the largest in the region. But as we now know, asbestos isn't something we want to be breathing in, especially in an enclosed area like a mine. So as health concerns over asbestos exposure grew, the demand fell into a steep decline. The blue asbestos mine in Wittenoom closed in 1966, and many of the town's residents left in hopes of finding less life-threatening work elsewhere, with the town itself officially closing in 2007. Since then, the Australian government has limited access to the once booming town and has even removed it from all official maps. But many of the structures are still there, and as of November 2021, 2 residents remain, while the local indigenous population has continuously petitioned to the Australian government to have the locale remediated. Number 12, Varosha, Cyprus. The town of Varosha in Cyprus was once so popular that many of the Golden Age Hollywood elite would come to visit. The likes of Liz Taylor, Raquel Welch, and Brigitte Bardot all paid a visit in their heyday, but now Varosha is a total ghost town. It was one of the hottest tourist destinations in the world in the early 1970s, but when Cyprus was invaded by Turkey in 1974, the residents of Varosha began to flee in droves as fighting drew closer and closer to their home. But while the town's original residents were all gone, the Turkish military maintained control since then. Now Vorkuta is fenced off, a shell of its former glory, and no one but military and UN personnel can cross the line. Attempts have been made to broker a deal to try and not restore and make Vorkuta livable again. But as you can see, nothing has changed. Empty high-rises sit alone on the beach and have been untouched for nearly 5 decades, slowly giving way to Mother Nature. Number 11. Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. The country of Turkmenistan, unfortunately, has a tumultuous history, with many of its innocent citizens falling victim to forces well out of their control. A former Soviet Union country under the control of the horrific President Pripyat Niyozov, Ashgabat was built in the hopes of creating a new prosperous era for Turkmenistan. A golden era for the country, if you will. And so construction of Ashgabat began in 1991. Gaudy, record-breaking buildings were erected to show off Soviet ingenuity to the world, mostly the US. And in the end, 543 buildings were all made out of luxury materials, and the newfound city was even home to the world's largest Ferris wheel. Meanwhile, though, in the rest of the country, life expectancy was at an all-time low. Today, Ashgabat is referred to as the City of the Dead because it appears to be so empty. The majority of residents live just outside of city limits, and much of the city has no access to electricity or clean water. It's a very strange city that is made mostly of marble, but the fancy facade hides many dark secrets, and while it may be open to tourists, most of them will leave with a bad taste in their mouth. Number 10. Krakow, Italy. Krakow is an old town that sits right in the arch of the giant boot that is Italy. The city actually dates back to well before 1060, and it's seen its fair share of armed conflicts since then. Cruel monarchs, armies, and poor political ideologies have all done their damage here. And while man-made strife certainly made life tough for the citizens of Krakow, it was geological disasters that made things even worse. Things eventually got so bad people began to leave in droves by the late 1800s. Earthquakes, floods, and mudslides all plagued Krakow to a point where living there was no longer safe. And by 1963, just 1,800 people remained, until they were forced to leave Krakow for their own safety to the newly built town below. The structures and streets are all still there, and Krakow has actually become a hotspot for not just tourists, but big-budget films as well, with productions like Quantum of Solace and The Passion of the Christ taking full advantage of the Italian ghost town's authentic feel. Number 9. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Centralia, Pennsylvania was a quaint and harmless place to live until a coal fire started underneath the town in 1962. This is not the type of fire you can just put out, and so it's been burning to this day and will most likely rage on for another 250 years. So what exactly happened here? Centralia was home to a local landfill, and during an attempt to clean it up all those years ago, the coal seams under the surface were lit, and residents began to trickle out ever since, abandoning their homes completely. Centralia is an absolute mess, and people weren't just afraid of their homes suddenly going up in flames, but the coal fires also caused sinkholes and carbon monoxide to be released into the air. Eminent domain was eventually used to take control of the homes of the residents who choose to stay despite their own safety, but they all agreed to give their property over to the government once they pass away. The Pennsylvania government finally condemned Centralia in 1992. And while Centralia is a ghost town, the highway running through it was given new life when it was covered in graffiti and art in honor of the people who once lived there. Number 8. Pripyat, Ukraine. In 1970, just 1 year after humanity finally set foot on the moon, Ukraine wanted to be part of the technological and scientific leap forward the world was witnessing, so they founded Pripyat. Pripyat was known as a nuclear city and would specifically house the thousands of workers who were employed by the nearby nuclear power plant. The city had a total of 13,000 apartments, enough schools to accommodate 5,000 children, 24 shops and restaurants, a movie theater, a hospital, everything a city would need to function on its own. And in the beginning, everything was working according to plan, and all was well within Pripyat. That is until April 26, 1986, when the reactor at the Chernobyl power plant blew. Most people know how the story goes from here. Toxic radiation was released into the air and the entire city of Pripyat was evacuated and residents relocated to another newly built city, Slavutich. Pripyat became a ghost town and a nuclear exclusion zone, and while people are officially allowed back in, it's a shell of its former self with abandoned buildings, rusted playgrounds, and irradiated wildlife. Number 7. Hashima Island, Japan. Also known as Gunkanjimi, or Battleship Island in English, Hashima Island sits abandoned off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan. The city was originally developed in 1887 as a massive residency for the people working in the undersea coal mines, and was once full of enough concrete high-rises to house well over 5,000 people. There were plenty of community buildings as well, so people would rarely have to leave the island. They could get their fill of clubs, bars and restaurants, shops and communal baths, and a pachinko parlor, both of which are cultural staples. The mine operated for nearly a century, but as Japan began to move away from a reliance on coal power, these types of jobs began to die out, and the mine near Hashima Island closed in 1974. But no coal and no jobs also meant no more living on this self-sufficient island, and no one was permitted here until 2009. And even then, only a small portion of the island is open to the public. But the abandoned island did become a UNESCO World Heritage Site and gives a cool glimpse into the country's history of rapid industrialization once it opened its borders to outsiders in the late 1800s. Number 6. Oradour-sur-Glane, France. Oradour-sur-Glane was a small but bustling farming village in France that, generally speaking, only knew peace. But when World War II reared its ugly head, the village fell under the rule of Germany. The German soldiers were brutal and, unfortunately for the residents of Oradour-sur-Glane, cared very little for human lives other than their own. Sadly, on June 10, 1944, the Nazi SS utterly destroyed the village, killing 642 people. There were very few survivors left, but they did manage to tell the tale. Once the war ended, however, the village was never repopulated and left as is, and remained a sign of the German war crimes against the civilians during the war. Now, Oradour-sur-Glane has been declared a memorial and a museum. The abandoned village remains totally preserved in its ruined state, and every year on June 10th a ceremony is held to commemorate the 642 lives that were lost at the hands of the SS. The locale is open to tourists, and walking through the village forces even the coldest of hearts to reflect on the horrors that humans are capable of. Number 5. Bodie, California. And here we have yet another mining town. Bodie, California was a mining town that saw a big uptick in its population in the late 1800s, with everyone trying to get a piece of the California gold rush. And the town did all right for about 17 years and was filled with all sorts of people from far and wide. But life was tough in the 1800s for anybody, and the citizens of Bodie were subject to rough winters, diseases, and plenty of mining accidents that ended in the deaths of too many of the town's inhabitants. And to top it off, crime was so high that Bodie developed a reputation for being a lawless place. It was truly the Wild West over there, and not everyone was happy about it. But like any bubble in the market, the bubble that was the California gold rush burst, and by 1882 many of the once prosperous mining companies went belly up. The once excited people of Bodie began to slowly pack their things and look for an opportunity anywhere but there. Bodie underwent a few more changes, and by 1940 became a total ghost town, and the only residents left were broken dreams. And by the 1960s, the California State Park System took ownership of the town and turned it into a state historic park. Number 4. Vorkuta, Russia. During Joseph Stalin's reign over the Soviet Union, his Gulag labor camps developed a reputation for probably being one of the worst places on Earth. The region was cold and unforgiving, to say the least, and serving a sentence there didn't always end well. But when coal production shot through the roof, people from all over the country arrived in the region looking for these new high-paying jobs in coal, and Vorkuta was a small town built to accommodate these new laborers. But as we all know, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the mines closed down, and as we see time and time again, the people leave after their jobs do. Vorkuta was still left intact. Today, there are still 50,000 people living in the city of Vorkuta, a stark contrast from the 1 million during the reign of the Soviet Union. But many of the buildings still lay abandoned. Things get a bit tricky for the people still left behind, because while many of them would love to leave the Arctic city, they can't afford to live elsewhere, and absolutely no one is willing to buy their homes amongst the sub-zero temperatures. Number 3. Kayaköy, Turkey. Back in the early 1900s, Kayaköy was a modest community in Turkey, mostly full of craftsmen. But Turkey was also engaged in the Greco-Turkish War, and in 1923, residents of Kayaköy were forced out of their homes due to the conflict. But the reasoning behind it is interesting and by today's standards a very foreign concept. The two opposing countries agreed to a population exchange, meaning Greek citizens went over to Turkey and vice versa, in an attempt to stamp out the region's religious diversity and maintain only one religion. And just like that, most everyone was forced out of their homes. Today, there are still about 350 homes and 2 Greek Orthodox churches from that era still standing, and still totally empty, and slowly but surely succumbing both to neglect and the elements. Number 2. Tawergha, Libya. Another ghost town unfortunately brought about by war and conflict can be found in Libya. Its name is Tawergha, and it was once home to 40,000 people. In the local language, Tawergha actually translates to the Green Island, but today it's anything but. It's still full of buildings, homes, schools, and everything a town needs to survive and be self-sufficient. But in 2011, the country found itself in the midst of a very serious and widely televised civil war. Fighting was incredibly intense, and the town of Tawergha was eventually occupied by a military group that was fighting against the current leader, Muammar Gaddafi, who had been in power since 1969. But when the anti-Gaddafi forces showed up to this once booming town, they forced everyone out, and now only about 250 of the original residents remain, all of whom are living in tents. Number 1. Ordos, China. When the Chinese government wanted to increase their gross domestic product, they came up with the concept of the Kangbashi district of Ordos. The new district would sit about 18 miles out of the main city. The roads alone cost $352 million to lay. The homes in the Kangbashi district took around 5 years to be completed, with many being sold, but there was one thing missing. The civic amenities like schools, shops, and restaurants weren't even close to being done. China's Kangbashi district wasn't able to build its own sufficient economy. It was more of a husk of an idea than an actual community. While the population is slowly growing, with about 100,000 residents today, there's still not much to do and nowhere to go within the district. Perhaps Kangbashi is meant to be a long-term endeavor, but until then, it's the largest ghost town this world has ever seen. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.